Hi, Lea Louise here, and look what I have, a new kit from the Fabric Hut. The color already has me very excited, and this pattern, look at this, Best Beginner Quilt Pattern. This is perfect. That means it's going to go together easily and quickly. So this is called the Modern Patchwork, and this is the throw size 64 by 72. And if you've had the quilt kits before from the Fabric Hut, you'll notice this looks a little different. Well, that's because everything is included in one shrink pack. And you don't have to keep track of things. You don't have to look for a piece here or there. Everything is included. Once you start on this, you have it all at your fingertips. So let me go ahead and just open this here. And the first thing I want to look at is the pattern. Now, a best beginner's quilt, there are certain expectations. I want it to be easy, simple, and I want to be able to understand the instructions. So let's take a look here at what we have. And okay, anyone who's used a pattern appreciates cardstock, right? How many times do you get this super thin paper and you use it and you tear it when you set something on it? This is really sturdy paper. I like that. And we have our general introduction. Now, notice these QR codes. This is awesome because this is a tutorial. The code will link you to a tutorial about how to learn different tips. And this is how to check on any updates. Let's say there was a printing mistake and it's been corrected. We want you to get that as soon as you start on your quilt so you can check here. And what do we, oh, sharp blades, all kinds of information. So you don't want to miss these codes. Now, if you use this kit, make the pattern, you can save this. Like I said, it's on sturdy paper, but there's also a cutting list. So while you're receiving all the pre-cut pieces, you can also remake this quilt. Since it's a simple one, it may be one you really want to do again. And let's see what we have. So initially we're going to make some blocks. All this is laid out. Notice how it's color coordinated, which helps you keep track of everything. And you see how the instructions are very clear about how pieces are going to go together. They lay them out, and we've got arrows, and it shows how to join everything so that you can get your entire row. That's perfect. Now, there are a couple things that you want to keep in mind about quilting, especially if you're a beginner. RST, right sides together. So when you see that down here, we want to put the right sides together when we sew them. And you'll notice that in the instructions right here, it's always explained thoroughly. We always want to use a 1/4 inch seam. It's narrower than regular sewing if you're used to garment sewing. The 1/4 inch is what we need for quilting, and if you want all your blocks to fit together perfectly, 1/4 inch is something you want to master, because then all your blocks will fit together and you'll get the size quilt that you want. So that may take a little practice initially, but your 1/4 inch is a huge success once you get there. And when you're quilting your blocks and working through putting them together, if something isn't quite right, check the seam allowance. Sometimes it can be as simple as an adjustment there. And then the recommended stitch length is a 2, and that is going to vary on machines, but generally speaking, on most machines, if you set it at 2.0, you're going to have a really good result. So then we go on to our next page is the assembly. So remember here, we put our blocks together, and now we're sewing those rows together. So here we are, and then how to stage this all. So you see how simple this is. The only assembly that we're doing small pieces is right here. And then we put them all together and we sew them into strips, which become our rows. And then those are going to be joined together. And we are going to have, here it is, our finished quilt. Now, once you get your quilt top finished, you want to quilt it and do the backing. You want to get your backing ready. So what you're going to need to do is take your backing fabric and follow these instructions. It's going to Explain about trimming off the selvages on the edge of your fabric. You know those narrow strips where the print is? That's the selvage, and that's what's used to hold all the threads together as these pieces are being woven and then printed. And you just follow the instructions. Your backing is always going to be a little bit bigger than your quilt top. Reason being is you want that backing to be the what do I want to say, the base, the structure that you're using as you quilt. And the top of the quilt will tend to cinch in a little bit and become just a little bit smaller as you're quilting, because the batting is taking up some of that bulk, and you want that bottom fabric, your backing, to stay nice and smooth. And that's what gives you a really nice puffy feel on your quilt. The other situation that can affect how that turns out is which batting you use. You can use real thin low loft battings. You can use the super thick, so you find what works for you. And I would recommend for your first quilt to use a low loft or a thin batting and see how you like that. That's great practice. If you use the super thick right away, that can be a little more challenging to direct your fabric through with that thickness. So try it on the thinner side, and even if it's just a matter of taking a block of scrap fabric, get an old sheet, something like that, and then all you have to do is put a fabric top, fabric bottom, batting in the middle, and give it a try. And what you can do is draw some lines and practice sewing your 1/4 inch seam allowance while you're at it. And then we're going to talk about how to bind the quilt, because you'll have a number of strips that need to be sewn together. And we want to sew them together on a bias like this. And then you get that bias seam you can see. And I'll show you that as we get to the end. And there we are. My goodness, that's going to go together very quickly. So let's go ahead and get started. Now for the fun part. Let's see what we have inside our package of fabric. And I really like this color. That's going to be pretty. Just want to see how this is folded and wrapped. Oh, look at that. Everything contained in nice. Oh my goodness, would you look at this? The backing is pre-cut. Ordinarily, I would expect to get a full length of backing and then cut it in half and piece it, but look at this. They've taken the extra step of cutting it. That way you don't have to worry about whether you're off center or cut it crooked. Everything is taken care of. That's a huge time saver, but also creating great accuracy for you. That's wonderful. Oh, and look at this. So everything is marked really well. Get my finger in here to get that plastic open. So remember, we said there are just 2 size blocks for this quilt. And this is it right here. We have the 4.5 and we have the 4.5 by 8.5. And then we have our binding. So this, and what do we have? Ooh, extra bag. Wow, look at that. So we have, once we start, if we don't get it finished at the first seating, which we generally don't, we have a Ziploc bag to put everything into. Or while I'm working on my quilt, I can put the backing in the Ziploc. Ooh, I'm really liking this. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we need to do first. The first step is going to be joining our blocks together. And so we're going to take the large rectangles and we are going to join them to these smaller squares. And let's see, let's get some fabric out. I'm just curious to see, I think there are 6. Yeah, look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different fabrics, and they're numbered. So if you need extra, you can certainly do that. And they are put together in pairs. Okay, that works well. Now, what I'm going to do is, because this is going to be the same for every block, this is going to be the background fabric, and it's going to be consistently placed throughout the entire quilt. So what I'm going to do is just set this at my machine. I'm going to put one of these on top of here, and I'm going to sew, and chain stitching, absolutely the best way to go. So let me show you how that's going to work, and then we'll start putting our blocks together. Assembling this block is very simple because we only have 2 pieces. We're going to take the small square, put it on top of the larger rectangle, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam all the way down the short edge. And as you're sewing along, you want to periodically, make sure right sides are together. I almost did it the wrong way. That's easy to do. But you do want to make sure that your seam allowance is consistently 1/4 inch. And the best way to check that is to bring in a ruler here. Get your ruler, and with your seam turned this way, I just place the line from my ruler right over the seam, and then I can see that my 1/4 inch seam allowance is right along the edge where I want it to be. So if you're not a seasoned quilter and you haven't done a lot of 1/4 inch seams yet, you do want to check periodically just to make sure you're on task. The easiest way that I find to get your 1/4 inch seam is to find where to line it up. Some sewing machines will have a 1/4 inch foot, which is handy, and I don't have that. What I use is I just find right here along my throat plate where the 1/4 inch seam is, and then I just make sure that my fabric follows that line. So for me, it's a visual connection with my machine, but everybody's going to find their own way that works. But the important thing is keep that 1/4 inch seam going. So I'm going to finish these up, and then we'll get them pressed because we're going to press everything towards the larger rectangle. And then we'll start the assembly process and putting our quilt together. It's going to be gorgeous. I love all these colors. All my pairs are sewn together. I've laid out the pattern that I want, and I have my first row stacked in order of how to sew them together. Of course, everything is pressed, so I'm going to have nice nested seams as I sew these. And I'm going to take the first block off, or the first strip, I should say, and add the second one. And you should always have alternating so that we have a white block and then we have a color block. And you just want to make sure you're on track as you're going through in order to keep the pattern, because you don't want to miss that, because it will be very visible in the quilt top if you don't align them in the same consistent way. So what I'm going to do, let me get my stitching lined up, and I'm just going to start at the top edge and get my 1/4 inch seam lined up, and I'm going to sew down. Now, this seam underneath is already going to be going in this direction, so I can sew right over that, keeping my 1/4 inch seam aligned. And when I come down here, now I don't want to stick my finger in there because it's just too easy to get your finger caught. You don't want to take that chance. But if the seam isn't laying well, or you're having a little difficulty, just get your seam ripper and hold it to the side. You don't want to hold it far enough in that it's going to interfere with the needle, but you just want to hold that corner down so that it sews through nice and straight. Okay, so the first pair in row 1 is sewn together. Now we're going to take the second pair. So I'll put this piece down, and I'm going to flip this one over and sew it on top. And we're just going to line this up on the corners. Make sure everything's nice and straight. Start our 1/4 inch seam. And you'll notice a lot of times what I'll do is I'll start my stitching and then I'll come in and I'll line up the other end, and I'll hold it with my thumb and finger. That way I know as I'm sewing, I'm keeping these together, and one fabric on the top or bottom won't get stretched and come up with an uneven end. I always want to make sure that these pieces align properly at the bottom. So by holding it this way as I sew, and then I use this hand, my left hand, to guide my fabric. And sometimes when you're coming along, you'll notice your seam might not want to align with the edges, and they kind of go a little wonky. Just lift this up and put it on top. Alternatively, you can come over on the other side and pull it under. So whatever works for you. And I just want to make sure everything is aligned nice and straight. And we want, see how that corner sometimes wants to flip up? Just take your seam ripper or stiletto, whatever little tool you have handy, not your finger. We don't want to get caught, because the other thing that can happen is when this comes down, your needle thumb screw, and your finger's right there, you'll get whacked on your knuckle. Ask me how I know. It hurts. Now we are going to keep continuing this process until we get all the way to the other end of this row, get all our blocks paired up. Then what we do is we'll take these pairs and join them together. And that will form our first row. So I'm just doing a few blocks here to show you how this works. So we cut our chain piecing apart, because chain piecing saves you so much time. So now I have a pair, and I'm going to take my next pair, and because I laid them out in an alternating pattern, this is going to fit right on top of here. So let's take this one, and we're going to align this right here. And again, I come down, I line up my bottom corner, making sure that I'm nice and straight and even. And see where this little piece is kind of pulling over, I'll just tuck that over to the side. So the little things you can do along the way will help to keep your seams aligned and nice and even. So we just continue doing this across the row, and we'll chain stitch all our pairs together, and then we'll come back, and we're just going to add everything right onto the edge here until our row is complete. Pull my thread there. So this is my last block, and I want to line that corner up. And this block is wanting to come down. Remember, we press it away from the light side. So all I have to do is turn this over and flip it so it goes the right way. And I do that as my pressure foot gets close to it, because that will hold the fabric down and keep that seam allowance right in place where I want it. Okay, now that we have our rows sewn together, we are going to attach each row to one another, and that's going to complete our quilt. Now, I will press this first, and what I do is we have even and odd rows. So count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and all the even rows will be pressed to the right side, and all the odd rows will be pressed to the left side. That way we can nest our seams. So that's what's next, and then our quilt's going to be all assembled. You should now have 6 rows of the blocks that you've made, and we're going to begin sewing the rows now. And as you remember, we press one seam, or excuse me, one row this direction and then the other row in the opposite direction. And the reason we do that is so we can nest our seams. And all that simply means is we want these seams to tuck in next to each other, and nesting in that they fit right in together. So my seam allowance goes this way, this seam allowance goes that way, and I'm going to put these right together. Now, when you put your thumb and finger over this seam, you're going to feel how it's going to fit really snug where those two seams come together. Now, try doing it this way. Pull it apart a little bit so there's a space. And you can feel that with your fingers, that there's a gap in there. And also do it to the other side, and you can feel because it's particularly thick. So after you do this a few times, you will be surprised how easy you are going to recognize whether or not that seam is nesting well. And I do go ahead initially and I'll pin the first few before I get started sewing. And then once I get going, I might, pin every 4 or 5, but I don't pin everything for every, there we go, for every block that we're joining. And so that'll just be a decision you'll make. And then what you can see here is now I'm just going to go ahead and sew down through the block and across both seams. You'll notice as I'm pinning this that I put my pin in so that it's holding the back seam the direction I want it to go. And then this seam will just and what I want you to notice is how I'm pinning this. I make sure that my seam allowance is going that direction. Now, as I'm sewing, I don't want it to flip over and go the other way. So I'm going to pin it with the pin holding that seam allowance in place. So as I'm sewing and I approach this, that seam allowance will be pinned right where I want it to be. So let me go ahead and get started, and I'll show you how we're going to sew this together. Now I'm going to begin sewing my seam. As I approach my pin, I get relatively close because I want my feed dogs to hold that seam down and in place. And then I can slowly take my pin out, and everything should stay right where I want it to. I'll sew through it, and then I'll readjust, and every once in a while I'll rake my fingers across if I see there's a gap in the fabric. I want them to line up nice and straight. And do the same. So I come to within about a 1/2 inch, and then I'll stop and I'll just make sure everything's where it needs to be. I'll pull my pin out and go across, and you notice I'm keeping my finger right here. That's going to help that seam underneath stay nice and straight so it doesn't want to flip. Okay, now I don't have any pins here, so let me show you what I'm going to do. I'll open this up, and let me just get this nice and straight, and you can see how these align. I got to trim some threads. I got some raveling happening here. So we want these seams to come right together like this. And when they align like that, that's just what I want. I'm going to put my seam right on top, and then I'm going to take my thumb and finger and hold that. And again, this is where it comes in handy, where you get used to feeling how that seam should be, where there's nudged together and there's no gap or there's no thick areas. And once you get used to that, then you're going to be able to hold that seam together without pinning it. Now, it's not, when I have a long distance to go like this, there's, I think, 60 plus inches. You can certainly go in and maybe pin every other or every third one, whatever works for you. And initially you can pin every one if that makes it easier. I find if I pin every so often, like maybe every 12 to 15 inches, I make sure I'm aligned well and not going to have any trouble. Of course, trim those threads as you're going. If these threads are left, they may show through when you're doing your quilting, depending on the color. If you get a dark thread behind a white fabric, it can show through. All right, so what I'm going to do is I can feel that that's right where it needs to be, and I'll just feed it right in. And then once I get over the seam, I'm going to adjust everything and come down to the next one. So you may find that it's quicker for you that you pin everything first. It's a matter of personal preference. There's no right or wrong. And then when I get here, I just make sure, and a lot of times I'll just do a double check and sew right through. So we'll do this for every row, and we have 6 strips, so there'll be 5 seams, and making sure that you press them in opposite directions. Just look at how pretty all these beautiful colors look together. And you see we have row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now I did my layout pretty scrappy, and I did not put a whole lot of thought into putting them in any particular order, and I really like how it turned out. And I know you're going to love doing this quilt too. It's simple, it's basic, it's easy, and like the pattern says, it's a great beginner's quilt. I do want to show you the rest. We have to do the backing now and the binding. So let me show you how that works. Now that your quilt is done, we are ready to get the backing. Oh my gosh, that quilt is beautiful, and this color on the back is going to look fantastic. Now, remember, we talked about the fact that these are pre-cut, so you're going to have 2 pieces, and they're the same size, so we're going to work with one at a time. And I want to open it out so that the selvages, and only the selvages, are going to be cut. I have my folded edge down here, and I'm going to kind of roll that up so I don't inadvertently cut the wrong side. That can happen if you're sort of getting a little carried away or in a hurry and not paying attention. And so I like to put little safety precautions in place just to make sure I don't make any silly mistakes. All right, I'm just trying to line this up here. And I'm going to fold my selvage in half because this measures, I'm pretty sure it's about a yard. Yes, this is 1 yard folded in half, so it's a 2-yard piece from end to end. And I have a 36-inch ruler that I'm going to use, and I'm going to put it right on this edge. Now, a couple things. When I'm going to center this so you can see everything I'm doing here. The selvage is a tighter weave, and you don't want that in your quilt, and you don't want it on your backing, because where that lays, it's going to be thicker and it may be visible, but it's also woven much tighter, which is why it won't stretch. And so that could potentially pull your seam in. And in order to avoid any of those problems, I come down just a little bit past my selvage, and I'm going to cut all the way across. Now, if you don't have a ruler as long as this, you can certainly fold this in half one more time. Now, this is 4 layers. If you fold it over once more, you're going to probably need to use a larger blade than your regular 45 millimeter. This is the 60, and this is great for doing extra layers. You can see how much bigger that blade is, so it'll go through more fabrics. All right, so my ruler is lined up. I'm ready to go. If I put my hand exactly in the middle, there's a chance my ruler is going to pivot. And so what I'm going to do is line this here, and I'm going to put my hand close to where I'm getting ready to sew or ready to cut. And I put my hands on the ruler, but I keep one finger on the fabric. That's going to eliminate the ruler from shifting or twisting. That'll help keep everything in the right place. So I'm going to go ahead and cut just past my hand, keep everything in place, do it again, and come right up here. And now I have a beautifully cut edge that's ready to be sewn together. So I'm going to set this aside and do the other, and then I'm going to show you exactly how we're going to put this together. With the selvages trimmed off, you're going to take your two pieces and place them together and align the long sides. Now, if you find that one of your sides of your fabric, your selvages, didn't get completely cut off, I can see where I left a little bit here, don't use that. Leave that to the outer edge and use the other end of your fabric, the other side, to be in your seam. This is going to be trimmed off when the quilt, after it's quilted, and then we go to bind it, we do our trimming of the sandwich, the quilt sandwich. So if you have a little bit, don't worry about it, just use it to the outside. Now I'm going to put my two pieces together, and first what I do is I'll clip it, pin it, whatever works. Actually, in this case, I prefer using the clips. The reason being is I have a really long piece of fabric, 2 yards long, which is over 70 inches. And if I put a lot of pins in there, chances are I'm going to grab it and stab myself. So what I do is I'll pin from the beginning and the end. And I put my clips in about 6 inches from the edge, just like this. And so that'll get me to the end, and then from here I can hold it by hand. This is just holding it in place while I'm getting ready to sew. And then I'm going to stretch this out and find the center. This worked out well because it was folded on the center. So I can put one clip here, and then I put another clip in the middle between these two, and another clip between these two. So that's a total of 5. And it's just to kind of hold everything in place, because when you're doing a long seam, sometimes the fabric on the top or the bottom can either stretch or get distorted, and you get down to the end of your seam and it looks like this. You've got more of one piece than the other. And this way, by securing it as you sew, it'll be at the same tension, which means one fabric won't be pulling more than the other, and it's going to lay flat. And that's the biggest thing. You don't want your fabric to be stretched out on one side or another, because when you go to press your seam after you sew this, one side can pucker a little, and it's going to be noticeable, especially when you're using all one color. So those are just a couple tricks that I use in order to get my quilt back ready to sew. And then what I'm going to do now is sew this up, and I'm going to use a 1/2 inch. Now generally in quilting we always use a 1/4 inch, but we do that because our seam is pressed to the side and you have less apt of having too much tension that can pull that seam apart. Having those two fabrics close to each other, on top of each other actually, as you press them, it's going to hold everything really snug. Now, I'm going to do this where I press it open. So after I sew it, I'm going to come back, I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam, and I'm going to press it open like this. And this is enough fabric on each side to keep it from pulling apart or distorting itself. It's just a more secure seam. And for the backing, we definitely want that because it's a big piece that we're sewing, and it's an integral piece that we definitely don't want to come apart. So 1/2 inch seam, put some clips or pins in there as you go, press it when you're finished, and then you're set. You're ready to put your quilt sandwich together. With your quilt sandwich finished, after you get your backing done, you get everything quilted, we want to put our binding on. So I'm going to show you next how to assemble your binding in order to join all your strips before putting it on your quilt. And then you're ready to go and make your own. Oh, congratulations, this is so exciting. Time to do the binding. When you're ready to finish off your quilt and bind the edges, we need a continuous strip of binding, which it's pre-cut at 2.5 inches by the width of fabric, and they're folded in half and stacked together. Now, for me, it's easy just to lay these pieces on my mat to cut off the selvage. And that way we have nice clean edges to sew together, because we never want to leave the selvage on any of the fabric we use to make our quilt, simply because it won't lay right. It's woven tighter and it won't look good in your quilt. It'll cause some of the seams to perhaps pucker and tighten up together. Now, to sew these, we're going to use what's called a bias seam. And the reason we do that is we want to allow this to be folded once and then twice. And that's going to create our binding. If we have a seam that goes straight down this edge, we're going to have it folded once and twice. And that's 4 layers of fabric right there. And then you have the other piece joined in. That's 8 layers, and that's going to create a really big bump right there in your seam, and it's very hard to sew through. So what we're going to do is elongate that seam by using a bias seam, and that means we're going to sew it on an angle. Now, what I do is I take my first piece right side up, and I lay it across my sewing machine. You see how it's going laterally this way. The second piece is going to come in line with the direction of the needle. And so I'm going to put these together. I generally will leave about just the littlest bit of an 1/8 inch where I can see the edge of the fabric underneath. That way I'm making sure that I'm not, perhaps coming over too far this way, and I'm not going to get a good clean seam, because I want to make sure that I'm not leaving anything out here. So we're going to line this up so I can see the bottom, and I want to make sure that this is straight across the top. If this doesn't get cut straight when you're trimming off your selvage, you might find that if you line up this corner, that this corner doesn't line up. You might get something like that. And that just means that this was cut at a bit of an angle, and if that happens, just line this piece up here. This is where we're sewing. This is the seam that's going to matter. And you want to make sure that that's all the way up to the edge. And again, you can see I let it hang over just the littlest bit. That way, I never cut myself short. And I have plenty of fabric and room to sew. Now, I'm going to sew directly from this point, just where those two come together. That's where my seam is going to start, and it's going to end right here. Same thing, right in that little notch. If it's easier, if you're not used to sewing without a direct edge, cut edge next to your presser foot to go straight, then you might want to draw a line with chalk or pencil. Now what I'll do is I'll just get let me set my needle in the right place. I want it to be in the center, and I'm going to drop my needle right there where I want it, and then I'm going to sew across. Now I find it pretty easy to come across this way because it's a short distance. And once I get my needle in there, I just line it up to the other corner that I'm going to, and I just hold this nice and straight. And as I come to the other side, I want to make sure that I fit right in that little notch. Now I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to lay it on top, right side up, and now I'm going to go to my next strip, and we will do the same thing. Just like this, and I'm going to get my needle right in place. Once I do that, then I just kind of readjust, make sure nothing shifted, and I'm going to sew all the way to the other corner, just like that. And you're going to repeat that until all of your binding strips are sewn together. Before we start cutting our strips apart, I'm going to trim off these triangles. And so what you want to do is just open up your seam binding and check your bias seam. You want to make sure right sides to right side, but also that these seams are nice and even. You don't want them to be, you know, a little wonky. Now, sometimes if you miss your corner up here, you can come up with a triangle that looks like this on the edge. And that just means you didn't hit the corner. You went too far in or out. So there may be some adjustments needed, but if you sew right into that corner like I showed you, you shouldn't have any trouble. So once we've checked and make sure everything's good, we're going to cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance right here. I'm going to take a look at this, and my seams lined up, my edges are lined up really well. And now all I'm going to do is trim off the excess corner, and I have a 1/4 inch seam, and this is going to be perfect when I go to sew my binding on. And you'll see when we sew this, see how these seams become offset. So they're not lined up straight in the middle where we had all those layers. If we were to do just a straight seam, this helps distribute and spread out that seam allowance, and it's going to make finishing your quilt much easier. Here's my finished quilt, and now it's time for you to finish yours. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial and I answered your questions. You're going to have a great time making this. It's a beautiful quilt, and it is not going to be overly complicated. I think you will enjoy every moment. Thanks so much for watching.